Well, shalom, dear friends, and welcome to our Genesis Bible study. Today we're going to be in chapter 22. The story we're going to read is, I think, one of the most powerful stories that is in the Bible for a variety of reasons. In Jewish literature, it's called the Akedah, and we will it's a word that has reference to the binding of Isaac. So that's kind of the title that this story um, uh, tells us. So one of the things I want to mention before we jump into the details of chapter 22 is the fact that I think from a kind of a Western Gentile perspective, prophecy, biblical prophecy, is limited to prediction and then fulfillment along a timeline, a chronological timeline. That is called a linear fulfillment of prophecy, and it's certainly legitimate. And I could point out many examples of linear prophecy. Micah prophesies that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, and then centuries later, he is born in Bethlehem. So there's a prediction and there's a fulfillment, and that's kind of the end of the story as far as linear prophecy is concerned. Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 describe the passion of the Christ, the Messiah, in arguably a greater detail than is given in the New Testament. So a prediction is made in the Old Testament era. In the New Testament era, Jesus is arrested, suffers the punishment of his accusers, goes to the cross and suffers the details of the predictions that were made by the psalmist and the prophet Isaiah hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. Another example of linear fulfillment. Brought from a Middle Eastern, particularly a Jewish, Hebrew perspective, a prophecy involves the repeat of patterns. Now, we have already seen some of those. We will see a very powerful one, arguably the most powerful one in the story today. And just to give you kind of a spoiler alert here, we are going to read Genesis 22 as a narrative, a historical narrative. It happened in the past. It had great significance in the past, which we will discuss. But also, as we're going through this text, we're going to hopefully demonstrate in a very persuasive way how this story of the demand that God placed on Abraham to sacrifice. And when I say sacrifice, I mean in the sense of the animal sacrifices that have been going on since the Garden of Eden, to sacrifice him in a way that will bring about his death. That will be fulfilled in a sense of repeated pattern centuries later in the New Testament, in God offering his own son, Yeshua, as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. And we will, one of the most striking things about this story in Genesis 22 is the details of the sacrifice of Isaac, and how they match up in just an extraordinary, obviously an intentional way in the sacrifice of Yeshua by God the Father. So yeah, we will talk about that as we go through this chapter. I do want to give a little bit of background. A lot of it we have already looked at before. Once again, we are referring to the dispensational theological chart of this particular era of history, which begins, I guess, after the age of human government and the destruction of the city and the Tower of Babel. After that, we have genealogies that bring us to the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are called the patriarchs. The fourth generation of that chosen family involves the sons of Jacob, Israel, that will constitute the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel once they enter into the promised land. And of course, the end of this period of time is the story of the Exodus, which actually leaves off prior to the Exodus from Egypt in Genesis. So we won't get the story of the Exodus in Genesis. That's kind of reserved for the book of Exodus. But it still does involve the story of the Exodus is still a part of the age of promise. The age of law, which follows, does not get started until the law is given on Mount Sinai. So the first portion of the Exodus, the first couple of years, are in the age of promise, and then from the giving of the law onward until the time of the Messiah, the New Testament era is called the age of law. As we've mentioned before, this particular age is called the age of promise because the promises that God made to all mankind, but most importantly to the chosen family, the chosen people of Israel. Of course, God was making promises all throughout history before this time and after this time. But this is the significant focus of the age of promise. It involves 430 years of history that we have talked about in the past. So that's the era we're talking about, and the prominent feature there is God's promises. And of course, the people that benefit the most from those promises are the people who have faith in them and in the God who made them. And their faith is credited to them as righteousness. That is how we get saved. It's by faith in God's promises. Probably the most well-known promise in the Bible is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So to whoever believes in him comes the gift of God's grace, which constitutes everlasting life, the born-again experience, the brand new start in fellowship with God, and then God's intimate involvement in our lives from the day we become believers until we're taken from this earthly realm into the eternal realm in the full fellowship of God. So that's kind of the gospel in a nutshell, and it springs from, it's all based on promises that God makes, which are acquired by us through faith in the giver of those promises and the legitimacy of the promises that God makes for salvation and healing and for so many other promises that he makes in the Bible. We've also been looking at these maps, which involve the travels of Abraham. And of course, they're charted out for us in the red lines on the map here. And then a couple of verses, Genesis 13 and Genesis 15, which give us the boundaries of the promised land. It's a much bigger piece of real estate than most people are aware of. It's much bigger than the modern state of Israel, the boundaries of the modern state of Israel. And it's never been possessed by the people that God chose to eventually and ultimately possess it. It is constituted, that land, the boundaries are constituted by the places where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob walked, and the land, the real estate that they laid their eyes on and saw, that was given to them by God. The geographical boundaries are given as being from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, which is pretty much the area that you see designated on the map here. There is one area of Abraham's travels that was not depicted on that first map, but it is depicted on this one, where he and Sarah went into Egypt, to the river of Egypt, to the Nile River, and then back again. And I have blown this map up a little bit for this slide so that we can see some of the locations where important events in the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob took place. I think in the last chapter, chapter 21, it was a chapter where the promised child Isaac was chosen by God, in contrast to Ishmael, who was Abraham's son through Hagar, the maidservant in the household. Ishmael was older, and I guess, in a worldly sense, would have been expected to be the prominent heir. But God was always, through his promises, talking about Isaac, who would be born to Sarah, not to someone else, even though Sarah was barren. And by the time they were finally able to conceive and bear children, they were both well beyond the age of childbearing. And a lot of those events take place at a place called Mamre, which is near Hebron. There is a modern city in Israel called Hebron, same city. And I think in Genesis 21, we have the story of Abraham and Sarah moving their operation to Beersheba. And so today, God is going to speak to Abraham and give him some orders, some commands that will be just absolutely extraordinary and very challenging and difficult for Abraham to fulfill. But he will pass this. He will pass this test. The sacrifice that God requires of Abraham is to take place on a mountain, a range of mountains, a chosen mountain out of a number of mountains that are available in a place called Mount Moriah. The arrow here is pointing to the city of Salem, which was an early name for a prominent city in Israel that is nowadays known as, and was known in biblical times as, Jerusalem. And it was to this mountain range, Mount Moriah, that Abraham was to take his son Isaac and offer him up. And just to give you a little hint here, Mount Moriah is the mountain range where the old city of David, the old city of Jerusalem, was built. And that is also I believe, the location of the place where God offered his own son, Yeshua, Jesus, as the sacrifice for the sins of the world. That was an act of redemption by the Savior of all mankind. So the mountain range is going to be the same. So the next picture I have is a picture of just a portion of the old city of David. It's actually kind of down the hill. It's down the slope on the east side of the old city of David. I think this archaeological feature here is called the Stone Wall. And it has been an area of interest for archaeological excavations for quite some time. Yeah, some of the recent discoveries there have really made this an interesting place. You can see all the areas that are dug out and the remnants of walls and staircases and so forth. So we're talking about the lower slope of the old city of Jerusalem. And then I want to also show you a 3D kind of a CG version of the place called Salem at the time of history that we're studying now. And again, these facilities here that you see depicted on this photo, on this diagram, are based on the archaeological excavations that have been made on the stone wall there. So let me back up a little bit and say that If you would ask most Bible scholars today where the temple of Solomon was built, and then later the temple of Herod during the Second Temple era, they would say that it is in the location where the Dome of the Rock stands now, on a platform on the top of that mountain that is generally called the Temple Mount, because that's where they think the temple stood. That's where those Bible scholars would say that the temple will stand in the future during the millennium, and probably during the Great Tribulation as well. That is to the north of the picture that you see here. This is a picture that is kind of looking from north to south. And this facility here, the archaeologists and the Bible scholars believe that this is a depiction of Melchizedek's temple. And so you can see here some rivulets, I think is the proper term, that are kind of cut in the stone foundation, and kind of basins to collect the blood that would be shed by animal sacrifices that were given in this place. We encountered Melchizedek in chapter 14 of Genesis, when Abraham was returning from rescuing his nephew Lot from the kings who came, the armies who came from the east, from Babylon, I suppose from Babylon, kidnapped Lot. Abraham, with his army of 318 special forces warriors, rode in pursuit, caught them, defeated them in battle, and rescued Lot and all the possessions, all the other hostages and people who had been kidnapped, and brought them back. And when they returned, one of the people who came out to meet them was Melchizedek. And we studied Melchizedek pretty thoroughly in Genesis chapter 14. We get some kind of extraordinary information about him from Genesis 14, but we get even more extraordinary information about him in the book of Hebrews. I think it was chapter 8 or chapter 4. I'm not sure what chapter it is, where it discusses, actually, I think it's chapter 7 and 8. Where it discusses Melchizedek, and it says that he is without beginning and without end, no father, no mother, no genealogy, etc., which leads me to the conclusion that he was a divine personage, that his appearance in chapter 14 and in other places where he crops up in the scriptures is what we would call a theophany, an appearance of God in human form, prior to the incarnation of Yeshua, which took place in the first century AD or Common Era. If that appearance of God was of the second person of the Trinity, then we would call it a Christophany, the same kind of an appearance by the Christ before he was born in Bethlehem. So this divine personage was a priest and a king. He was the king of Salem, this area right here that we see depicted on this. What would this be, like a diorama or a, yeah. So he was the king of the city of Salem, which we pointed to on the map, later would become the city of Jerusalem. And he was also a priest of the Most High God. Interesting thing that when he was having fellowship with Abraham, Melchizedek brought out gifts of bread and wine. Now, I think there's no doubt, based on the archaeological evidence, that Melchizedek, as a high priest, was sacrificing animals. That was the consistent practice in the Old Testament, kind of foreshadowing and predicting the ultimate sacrifice of the Son of God, the Messiah, in that same city of Jerusalem, on that same Mount Moriah, for the sins of the world many centuries later. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that although the majority of Bible scholars place the Temple Mount up on what is commonly known as the Temple Mount, north of this area, these archaeological excavations along the stone wall have uncovered what the archaeologists believe is Melchizedek's temple. And they place it right here. The location is just above the Gihon Spring, which is on this picture depicted right here. This would be the Kidron Valley running down there. So Melchizedek's temple was right above the Gihon Spring. A supply of water was necessary when you were sacrificing animals because of all the ceremonial cleansing that required water to take place, and also just to clean up the bloody meth from these animal sacrifices. And so they place it right here. They place Melchizedek's temple right above the Gihon Spring. Now, I have come to the conclusion that Herod's temple and Solomon's temple were not on what is thought to be the Temple Mount, but were south down the hill, right about in the location of Melchizedek's temple. I actually think because Melchizedek's temple was at in the lower part of the slope leading up to Mount Moriah, I believe this right here, the upper part, the higher ridge right here is actually, I think that is Mount Moriah. And like I say, this is the lower slope, but it gives us the north and south orientation of where Melchizedek's temple was. So I would say the temple of Solomon and Herod were up on Mount Moriah here, but above the Gihon Spring. Now that's based on a lot of historical reports of the location of the temple of Herod and the temple of Solomon, but also there's biblical evidence for it that we just won't be able to get into now. If you're interested in this subject about where the location of the temple is, particularly if you suspect that it might have been in the old city of David rather than up on the modern day Temple Mount, read a book by Ernest Martin called The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. Came out in about 2002, I believe, and is a fascinating, very detailed, very well-researched book that would argue for the temple being in the city of David. And that has all kinds of implications for the situation today, and maybe opportunities to build a temple, maybe in our day and age, in a place that is not the Temple Mount, because that is not, in my opinion, where the temple was located before. So anyway, I think this is the area where the sacrifice of Isaac would have taken place, probably up on this upper ridge that was not yet developed into a city. This would be kind of a wooded, forested area. This would be the city of Salem. Here would be some of the houses and businesses and stuff like that built at the city. And then probably up here a little higher would be where the Temple of Melchizedek was. But the Mount Moriah where the Akedah took place, I think, is up on this mountain ridge where I've got my pointer wiggling around up there. So that's where Abraham and Isaac will be headed today. No, he was not to be beheaded. He was to be sacrificed as an animal sacrifice. That's where they were going to travel towards their destination. Now, we learn a lot about this story from Genesis 22, but as we've been doing in past videos, we're going to refer once again to Hebrews 11, which is the story of the faith of the patriarchs. Some people call it the Hall of Faith, not the Hall of Fame, but the Hall of Faith, because it is kind of an exaltation of all the ancient heroes of the Bible who believed God's promises and benefited by them. So a few details are given to us in Hebrews chapter 11 that are not given to us, in Genesis 22. And let's just read this short pericope. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Yitzhak, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. That should ring a bell with many people who are familiar with John 3:16, but it's not talking about Jesus in this context. It's talking about Yitzhak, the only begotten son of Abraham. Trouble is, Isaac was not the only begotten son. Abraham had begotten a son by Hagar, an older son who was, probably the obvious choice to receive the inheritance and the fulfillment of the promises. But God made it clear in the previous chapter, chapter 21, that his choice was Isaac and not Ishmael. And Ishmael and his mother were actually banished from the family and settled in the Negev, actually down around Beersheba. So, he received the promises, offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Yitzhak your seed shall be called. That's what we studied about in chapter 21. God says, it's Isaac who is my choice, to be the called one, the chosen one, not Ishmael. Abraham concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So, one of the things that has got to challenge you when you read the story of the Akedah, the binding and sacrificing of Isaac, is how could a father do that? How could a father agree to offer up his son? It seems like an immoral request for God to make. And I think one of the things that we can learn is that if God asks us something that seems ungodly, seems out of character for God, if we're sure that it's God talking, then we can be pretty confident that that the thing that he's requiring of us is going to be prophetic, it's going to be symbolic, it's going to be significant, it's going to be figurative of maybe something bigger that God is doing. And I certainly believe that's the case in this demand that God placed on Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. So how was Abraham able to, morally and mentally and emotionally carry through with this command and actually take his son up there and proceed with the sacrificing of his son? It was, according to the New Testament, the inspired text of the New Testament, that he concluded that God was able to raise him up. Now, one of the promises that God had made to Abraham was that through his seed, and that chosen seed was Isaac, that Isaac would have children, and the next generation, Jacob, would have children, and each succeeding generation would have children. And eventually, that family would grow to the size of a nation, which they did during their time of captivity in Egypt. They went in a family, they came out a nation. Abraham was probably quite aware at the time God made this demand on him to sacrifice his son, that Isaac didn't have any children yet, but God had promised that he would have children. And so it was kind of up to God to resolve the quandary, to resolve the seeming impossibility of God keeping his promises if Isaac gets sacrificed. And we'll see how God does that. But the conclusion, apparently, that Abraham came to, even before they arrived at Moriah, was that God was able to raise him up even from the dead and allow him to have those children and fulfill those promises. So I think that knowledge and that awareness is the thing that enabled Abraham to take on this challenge and be obedient to God. And there were certainly rewards involved for his obedience and his faithfulness. Without further ado, let's go ahead and check out our text for today. We're using the Accordance Bible software, reading from the English version, New King James Version, with some, Strong's aids. And then we've got a Hebrew Old Testament, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament called the Septuagint, And then we've got Finest Dake's Bible study notes in the fourth window. So let's look at Genesis 22 in the New King James Version. Now it came to pass after these things would be the things of chapter 21, most significantly the choosing of Isaac to be the chosen child through whom the promises would be fulfilled. Came to pass after those things that God tested Abraham. The word tested there is nasa. It's the same kind of testing that Satan did for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and did again with Yeshua, Jesus, just before he began his public ministry, 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, tempted by Satan. I think we would say, since our English term tested or tempted is more specific than the Hebrew, nasa can mean either one, tempted or tested. I have used the distinction that to nasa in the sense of tempting is to try to get someone to sin, try to get someone to do something that they know is morally wrong. Testing, on the other hand, is not to try to get them to do something wrong, but to put them in a situation where faith can see them through. They can learn some important lessons and be stronger spiritually on the other side of the test. So I think that's why the New King James uses tested instead of tempted. Some of the other possibilities that Dake suggests is to prove. He proved Abraham by giving him this opportunity to be obedient under extraordinary circumstances and reap the rewards of that obedience. So he tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. Hineni is the Hebrew for that. And that is usually when God calls somebody, just go ahead and say Hineni, which means here I am, like your servant is listening. Then he said, take now your son, your only son. Hebrew says your only begotten son. Both are true. The word begotten, well, in a sense, it does show up here. The Hebrew is et, which is the direct object indicator. Bincha is the ben, or the son of you. Take your son. Et, another direct object indicator. Yehidecha. Yahad means the one and only. So he's the one and only son. We've talked about that already. Ishmael was also a son who had been fathered by Abraham, but again, he was not the chosen one. So when God calls him the Yehidecha, he is saying that he's the only chosen one, the only one that matters in the story and program of salvation. Asher, the one which achav ta, the one that you love. So still, drawn directly from the Hebrew here, the term only son Isaac still rings very true with John 3:16, the only begotten Son of God, whom you love. Take your only son Yitzhak, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. That's the mountain range that we were talking about earlier in the PowerPoint, and offer him there as a burnt offering. A burnt offering is an olah, and in a burnt offering, the entire sacrificial victim is completely consumed by fire on the altar. Either God brings fire down from heaven, or the priests kindle a fire under it and burn it up on their own. But a burnt offering is completely consumed. And some of the other offerings, only parts of the animal are offered as a sacrifice. The rest of the animal can be eaten either by the priests and Levites or by the offerer and perhaps his family. That burnt offering, is to be on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. It's in the land of Moriah. It's one of the mountains that I tell you. And when we were looking at the PowerPoint, I talked to you about, a number of different mountains there in Jerusalem. If I, in the area of Jerusalem, if I had a map, a modern day map of Jerusalem, I could point out the mountains. But Moriah is usually a reference to the city of David. Then further north on the Mount of Moriah is where the Temple Mount stands. That used to be, during the Maccabean times, what was called the Baris, B-A-R-I-S, which was like the barracks for the Israeli army of David and Solomon and so forth. So there was like a fortress there. And I think if you read Ernest Martin's book about the location of the Temple Mount, you'll find that the present day Temple Mount was actually the Roman fortress of Antonia, where the Roman legions had their barracks and their camp, and that the temple was just south of that in the old city of David. So I encourage you to read that book if you're interested in the location of the temple. So yeah, there are a number of mountains that surround Moriah there. To the west, that mountain range is called Zion. In earlier times, when the city was limited to the old city of David, the city of David was called Zion. But when it expanded to the west, on that mountaintop, that mountain then took on the name Zion, and the city of David just was called the city of David, or the Ophel in some places. Then further north is Mount Scopus. To the east is the Mount of Olives. So there are lots of mountaintops in that region. And I think God pointed Abraham to the one where Yeshua would ultimately be sacrificed. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, some Naarim with him, and Yitzhak his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering. So when they got to the mountaintop there, Abraham was going to have to build an altar. He would probably do that out of stones. He would just pile up some stones and make an altar. And then he would arrange this wood that he had split on the top of the altar. And then he would lay his son on top of that wood and bind him there, tie him there so that he couldn't escape if he got afraid. And then he would sacrifice him by bleeding him, by cutting his throat and allowing him to die from a loss of blood in that neck wound. And then he would set fire to the wood and would kind of completely burn up his son Isaac. That was what was being required of him. So he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. So he'd been wandering through the land. He kind of knew the lay of the land. So when God told him where to go, he knew where to go from Beersheba to Salem, saw the place God was talking about. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." The "we" is important here. Let's see. We will come back to you. Let me find my Hebrew here. It's not lighting up for me. Let's see. The na here, that's a third person plural, or a first person plural. We will come back, elechem, to you. So we will come back. He says, we're going to go worship, and then we will come back. Well, who's the we? There's just Abraham and Isaac going up that hill. So one of 2 things are happening here. Abraham is saying, he's saying to himself, I'm going to take my son Isaac up that hill, and I'm going to kill him there and destroy his body. And then only I am going to come back to you. But if I told these young men what I was going to do, they might stop me from doing a horrible, sinful thing. So he may be lying to them. He may be telling them that the two of them were going to go up and come back, so that they would not interfere with the sacrifice that were about to take place. He might be lying, but he might be telling truth based on what he understood about God's being able to resurrect the dead. So he might be telling them, I'm going to take this young man up there, and the part I'm not telling you is I'm going to sacrifice him there. I'm going to put him to death. Then God is going to raise him back up again in a resurrection, and then we'll be back and we'll meet up with you, and he'll be alive and well. Well, God has a third alternative that he hadn't talked to Abraham about, but he wants Abraham to deal with this challenging thing with those two options to look at. So Avram took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. They're going up the hill. So what did he take along with him? He took the wood. Now, one of the interesting things about the story of Yeshua is that when he was condemned to death, he was executed on a cross made of wood, and he was forced to carry the wood of his cross to the place of his execution, probably the same place that Isaac was to be offered. So Yeshua had to carry his own wood of the sacrifice, and that's what this is called, the Eitz Ha'olah, the wood of the sacrifice, because all burnt offerings required fire. Now, the wood wasn't burning when Yeshua was carrying it, and it wasn't burning when Isaac carried it up the hill. But Abraham probably had a torch. He took the fire in his hand and the knife, and the two of them went on together. So both Isaac and Yeshua are bearing the wood of their sacrifice to the same mountaintop. But Yitzhak spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." What is that? What did he say in Hebrew? Hineni, here I am, my son. Then he said, Isaac said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" So Abraham has been offering burnt offerings frequently enough that Isaac knows how this is supposed to happen, and they've got everything they need for a sacrifice except the sacrificial victim. So he asks his dad about this, like, we've got everything here we need here for a sacrifice, but where is the animal that's going to be sacrificed? Where is the lamb? The say in Hebrew. Shin He. And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. Now, we are reading from the New King James Version, which is very faithful to the Old King James Version. But the phrase that we have in the King James Version is, let me bring it back up here, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." Let me bring it back up here on my English. "My son, God will provide for himself." In the Old King James Version, the word "for" does not appear. So what is it in the Hebrew? Bani, nope, wrong verse. Maybe the verses are off here. Omer Abraham, Abraham said, "Elohim yireh lo." Yireh lo is what is translated, "God will provide himself," Haseh, the lamb. Now the Hebrew here is challenging, because the root word, if you look down in the information window at the bottom of the page for yireh, if you look down in the information window at the bottom of the the bottom of the screen, it says that ra'ah is a verb, a third person masculine singular, which means to see, like to see with your eyes. It also implies understanding, but to see with the eyes. So Resh Aleph He means to see. And then the other word here is lo, which just means to him. The lamed here means to, and the holam vav that we see, this letter, means like who's to who? To him. God will see to him. So where do we get the idea of provide? Even in the information window at the bottom of the page, on the second line down there, the translation is provide. So see and provide seem to mean the same thing. Well, this is challenging to us who speak English, but if we understand that when the Bible talks about God seeing, there's more implied than just looking upon. What this is saying, if God looks upon a situation that needs his intervention, he will provide. Okay, so that's what the Hebrew means with this. But based on the King James Version of the Bible, King James says God will provide himself. It sounds like God himself is going to be the lamb. And if we know this is also talking in a prophetic way about the sacrifice of Yeshua for the sins of the world, that's exactly what was going on there. That God was sacrificing himself. The second person of the Trinity was sacrificing himself as a lamb, as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And that is a wonderful insight into the King James Version. But unfortunately, this is one of those things that I wish was true, but I'm afraid it's not. I'm afraid God is not saying, or Abraham is not saying, God will provide himself being a lamb for the sacrifice. What he is saying is God will see and provide for him or to him a say. And we will see as this story plays out that there is a lamb, an animal, but it's not God. God is not going to sacrifice himself on that altar on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22. He will do it later. And in that case, it will be God providing himself a lamb, but that's not what the Hebrew says. And unfortunately, like I say, I wish that was true, because it would tell us so much more about the sacrifice of Yeshua. But God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there, piled up some stones for an altar, and he placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac, his son. Now here's where we have the word akad, from which we get the akidah, the binding of Isaac, the traditional Hebrew title for this story, this chapter of Genesis. He bound Isaac, his son. I think this was commonplace with animal sacrifices, so the animal wouldn't like wiggle off the altar. It would be bound, so its movement would be restricted. If you've ever gone hunting and killed an animal, particularly a larger animal, I think even after they're dead, their body still continues to convulse and things like that. So an animal could be bled dry and still convulse on the altar. So I think it was common to bind the animal sacrifices before placing them on the altar. And so he bound Isaac for a couple of reasons. So that death throes kind of thing wouldn't happen to Isaac once he was bled out. But also Isaac, once he realized what was going on, he might be very fearful and would try to, get away from his dad and save his life. What do they call that? The survival instinct might kick in. So he bound his son Isaac and he laid him on the altar. Now there are connections with this term binding with Yeshua. So one of the things that is sometimes depicted in the movies about Yeshua is, yes, he's nailed to the cross. The Bible said he was nailed there. But oftentimes the nails are depicted as going through the palm of his hand rather than the wrists where crucifixion was actually done, where the nails of crucifixion were actually pierced the wrist instead of the palm. The palm would not support the weight of a body. The nail would just rip through the skin and the body would fall down. And so when they crucified people, they wanted them firmly there. Well, people who believe that the nails were put in his hand rather than his wrist, both of which is called a yad in Hebrew. If they depict in the movies Jesus having nails in his hands, they usually show his arms being tied to the cross by ropes, so the body wouldn't fall off the cross. But also, this idea of binding could have to do just with the appearance. In order to bind Isaac, I imagine Abraham used some ropes or vines or whatever he had available, cords, to wrap around Isaac's body and probably attach him to the wood for the sacrifice. So there would be kind of a striping effect of wrapping these ropes. And in the movies, you see these ropes wound around Jesus' arms to hold him there. And it gives the appearance of stripes. And akad can mean that as well, to bind or the appearance of stripes, like ropes or cords would produce. Well, in all probability, I think most certainly when Yeshua was crucified, the nails went through his wrists and held him securely, so no ropes were needed. And no ropes are mentioned in the Bible. But there is an appearance of striping on Yeshua's body, and that is due to the whipping he endured. So each of these stripes would produce either welts, red welts, or lacerations, and the blood would begin to flow from them on his back, probably on his front as well. And so when he went to the cross, there would be the appearance of stripes. So what's the significance of that? Well, Isaac was on the altar with the appearance of being bound because he was bound, so there were stripes on his body. Yeshua went to the cross not because of ropes, but because of the whipping. But I think a practical and a spiritual significance to this is that the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 53, I think it's verse 4 or 5, maybe 6, chapter 53 at any rate, by his stripes, by Yeshua's stripes, we have been healed. We have been healed. It's an accomplished fact. This is the foundational basis for divine healing. All the healings that Jesus did were based on this promise that God made in Isaiah 53, that he would produce healing by the stripes of Yeshua, by the striping effect of the whipping he endured, by the punishment to his body, and that produces healing. So there's that connection as well. So here, once again, I wish in Isaiah 53 that the inspired text had used this word akad to talk about Jesus' stripes, but it doesn't. It uses another word, and that word is chaver, which also means stripes or the appearance of stripes, which does fit the situation with Yeshua and the whipping he received. But the interesting thing about that word is that it is also the word for friendship. If you are my friend, I would call you my chaver. And in that sense, in the sense of friendship, the chaver is the thing that binds friends together in love and loyalty and devotion and things like that. So the stripes of Jesus also imply, I think, the reason that he was held there. It wasn't by the nails. It wasn't by the ropes. It wasn't even the appearance of stripes on his body due to the whipping. It was his love for you and me that held him to the cross. The haver, the stripes that bound him to the cross as an expression of love for you and me. So, verse 10, let's see. He bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar upon the wood. Didn't set the wood on fire yet because he hasn't bled him out yet. I mean, he doesn't want to torture him by burning him to death. And Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the knife to slay his son. So he's going to go through with it. He's going to do what God told him to do, trusting that if God allows him to go through with it, God will have to raise him back from the dead to fulfill his promises. But the Malach Adonai, the Malach Yahweh, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And so he said, guess what? Hineni, here I am. And he probably said it with some enthusiasm, because if somebody doesn't speak up, if somebody doesn't intervene, this child is going to die. And it's hard to tell what the age of Isaac was at the time this happened. Hard to tell how old he was. Some people say a teenager. Some people may say maybe in his 20s. He was an older guy, and he's going to get married soon. In the next chapter, or maybe the next couple of chapters, he's going to get married. So this voice speaks from heaven. Let's talk about the Malach, the angel of Adonai, the Malach Yahweh. Oftentimes in the Bible, this is God himself speaking from heaven. It could be like a booming voice from heaven. That could be the angel of the Lord. There could be a physical manifestation of a being that looks like an angel, maybe with wings, but it's actually God himself appearing in angelic form. Or it could just be a regular, ordinary created angel with a message on a mission from the Lord to deliver a message to Abraham. So it could be any one of the three. And he said, here I am, Hineni. And he said, God said, do not lay, or the angel said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. I know that you fear God. Yirah, which sounds very much like ra'ah, to see, but it means like you fear God in the reverential sense. Now, I think the kind of fear that Abraham experienced when God told him to do this and when he starts to carry through with it is certainly reverential. He recognizes this is God and he's going to do what God tells him to do, even if it's unthinkable. But I imagine he is also just filled with fear and trembling about what's going to happen to Isaac if he does what God says and what God's going to do to him if he doesn't do what God says. So now I know that you fear God. He passed the test. Our text said God tested, not tempted, but tested him. And so he passed the test here. Since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and he looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, an ayil, caught in a thicket by its horns. Now, an ayil is a male, smaller animal. It can be either a goat or a lamb, a sheep. It can be either one, and it doesn't tell us whether it's a goat or a ram, but it can be either one. It doesn't tell us, but I'm guessing this was a lamb, just to fulfill the idea of the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So if God is going to provide a animal substitute that speaks symbolically of the Son of God, of Yeshua, and since Yeshua is called the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, I'm thinking this is a lamb. It's a male lamb, and it's caught in a thicket by its horn, so it can't get away. It's bound, Akedah. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Tachat, his son, which oftentimes means under, but in this case, it means instead of. Tachat bano, instead of his son Isaac. Great relief. It's got to be on Abraham's part that he didn't have to kill his son Isaac. God didn't have to raise him from the dead either, but Abraham was convinced that he would have if necessity required it. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. Provide. Interesting thing here is the name of the place in Hebrew is Yahweh Yireh. This is, now I'm going to use an expression here that I hate. You've probably heard the term Jehovah Jireh. Jehovah means absolutely nothing, and that's what happens when you try to pronounce the sacred name of Yahweh with the substitute vowels that are given here. If I just pronounce this word as it's written, I'm going to come up with not Jehovah, but Yahovah, which comes across in English as Jehovah. But these vowels are the vowels for Adonai, the vowels in Judaism that you're supposed to pronounce with the consonants for Adonai. And that's to preserve the sacredness of the name. And that practice carried through in the New Testament as well. Yahweh in the New Testament is always Kurios, and you can't tell whether that's Adonai or whether that is talking about Yahweh. So Jehovah Jireh, and again, this Hebrew word, if you pronounce it with the vowels, which is completely proper to do, and instead of a yod, you pronounce it with a J, it's Jireh, Jehovah Jireh. Well, in Hebrew, this is pronounced Yirah, and it means to see. Look at the information window down at the bottom of the page again. That's our old friend Ra'ah, and it means, so Abraham calls the place Yahweh Yirah, the Lord sees. So why in our English does it say provide? Because the English translators understand that when the Bible talks about God seeing and perceiving a necessity, he provides for that necessity. When what God sees calls for an intervention, he intervenes and provides for whatever the situation that requires. So the English is correct. The Lord will provide. Yahweh Yirah. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord, Adonai, it shall be provided. Again, Ra'ah. So we could say Ra'ah in Hebrew means to see or to provide, or we could say it means to see and provide. So that's why this place is called what it's called. Then the Malach Adonai, the Malach Yahweh, called to Avram a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn. So if God is saying, I have sworn by myself, then it sounds like that angel of the Lord is God himself, doesn't it? So I'm going to say that one is settled, and the Malach Adonai who appeared on this mountaintop to Avram and Yitzhak was God himself. So he says, by myself I have sworn, says Yahweh, says Adonai, because you have done this thing. The thing he has done is obeyed God, and you have not withheld your son, your only son. God emphasizing that idea of only begottenness, like in John 3:16. He says, blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand of the sea, which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Now, all of this except the last expression, possessing the gates of their enemies, God has already pronounced repeatedly to Abraham. He will repeat it to Yitzhak. In fact, I think he's repeating it to Yitzhak here. And he'll repeat it again to Jacob and then to the sons of Jacob. It's the promises, it's all the aspects of the Abrahamic covenant. And he's repeating it here again. And I think the reason he's repeating it here again is he might be hinting that if Abraham had disobeyed him, he might look for somebody else to make a covenant with. But since Abraham obeyed him. His faith was counted to him as righteousness. And he assures him that the Abrahamic covenant is in effect. It is intact and will be brought to bear. Now, this idea of possessing the gates of your enemies, I think, is a reference to eventually the Israelites are going to possess the promised land, and they're going to drive out the Canaanites and the Hittites and all the other Tites that are living in the land. So here's kind of what would it be? Kind of an addenda to the Abrahamic covenant that becomes a part of it. That not only is the land promised to them, but they will take it from their enemies. They will defeat them in battle and possess their territories in victory. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Again, part of the Abrahamic covenant, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham turned to his young men, returned to his young men, and they arose together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. Now, I'm going to share something with you that I don't fully agree with, but it's kind of a cool interpretation of this passage. One of the things Chuck Missler, one of my favorite Bible commentators and Bible teachers, says about this story is, verse 19 tells us, not that Abraham and Isaac returned, but that Abraham returned. Now, Chuck says, did Isaac return with Abraham to the young men? Yes, undoubtedly he did, but the inspired text does not say so. We have heard the last of Isaac until he meets Rebekah in whatever chapter that happens, where they meet and get married and continue the next generation of the chosen people. So Isaac does not appear in the story until that time. And what Chuck Missler says is, in the story of Yeshua dies on the cross, and then he rises again. In a sense, even the Bible says that Abraham received his son by resurrection in a figurative sense. But then Jesus disappears from the scene. He ascends into heaven, promising to return in the last days to take his bride to himself. Well, who's the bride? Who's the bride of Christ? It's us. It's the church, and the blessed hope of the church is that Jesus will keep his promise that he made in John chapter 14. He says, "You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go there to prepare a place for you." He's talking to his disciples. He's talking to you and me. He's preparing a place for us in heaven. And if I prepare a place, I will come again to take you to be with me, that you may be where I am. That's the rapture of the church. That's the rapture, the resurrection of the righteous. And we're still waiting for that to happen. So where is Isaac gone? Well, he obviously returned home with Abraham, but according to the sacred text, he disappears from the scene. When will we see him again? We see him again. He's named again. The story goes back to narrate about his life with his bride, Rivka, with his bride, Rebekah. So Chuck thinks this is an allusion to the fact that the Son of God died for the sins of the world, rose again, ascended into heaven, and he will return to take his bride to himself. So Isaac disappears from the story, and we don't see him again until he takes his bride, Rebekah. Okay, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose together, and they went to Beersheba. I think that's where they took off from. And Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. Now it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, indeed, Milcah has also borne children to your brother Nahor. Nahor was the surviving brother of the three, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran died before they got to Haran. And Nahor was still alive there, but apparently there was a reproduction challenge in that branch of the family. But now Milcah has conceived and given birth to a child by Abraham's brother Nahor. Verse 21, Chuz, his firstborn, and Booz, his brother. Cool names, huh? Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Yidlaf, and Betuel. Betuel is going to turn out to be, who's that going to be? Rebecca's dad. Okay. So this genealogy that's given here of the brother of Abraham, Yitzhak's uncle, this is the genealogy of the gal that God has chosen to be Yitzhak's wife. Bethuel begot Rivka. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Rumah, also bore him Teva, Gaham, Tachash, and Ma'akah. So those are all the children up there in Padan Aram, up there in Syria, around Haran, where Abraham had been living before he moved south into the Promised Land. So that's the end of chapter 22. I believe, well, I won't get into what chapter 23 is about because I don't want to give you any wrong details. So be sure and tune in for our next video, our next Bible study on chapter 23. Let me give you the blessing, the priestly blessing from the Old Testament, and we'll give it the way I think it was intended to be given in Hebrew, with the Lord's name spoken. Yivarechecha Yahweh vayishmarecha, Ya'er Yahweh panav elecha v'yuchunecha, Yisa Yahweh panav elecha vayasem lecha shalom. And that means the Lord, or Yahweh, bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh look upon you with favor, or lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. Shalom, dear friends. Hope we see you next time.